the questions keep coming right now on the live feed. I just want to start off with something. I mean, you talk a lot about sleep and waking up to sunlight, and we got a lot of questions about waking up to sunlight. So I try to do a huberism, as I call it, and look at the sunlight this morning before our Ask Me Anything segment. And is that supposed to make you feel invigorated? What's it supposed to do if you look at sunlight first thing in the morning?
Yeah, great question. And I should just say that while in ideal circumstances, you would get up, go outside, and the sun would be out, and you look at the sun, that would be the best circumstance. You do that for maybe 5-10 minutes. Of course, allowing yourself to blink, never force yourself to look at any light, sunlight or otherwise, so bright that it's painful, because you can actually damage your eyes if you force yourself to look at a bright light. There are a lot of mechanisms to prevent that. But that said, some days you'll go out, it's overcast. In that case, it can still be very bright, even though it's overcast. You don't need to look directly at the sun. Just try and get a lot of that so-called ambient light. Ideally with sunglasses off when you do this. Eyeglasses and contact lenses are absolutely fine, even if they have UV protection. Okay, so how is it supposed to make you feel? Well, there are a couple of things about this. One is the whole system of using light to set your circadian rhythm for wakefulness and to feel better throughout the day. It's what we call a slow integration system. So it's going to tap into hormone systems and neurotransmitter systems in the brain and body that kick in over the course of minutes to hours. So it's not going to be an instantaneous, like, a shot of espresso, which is what I'm drinking this morning. It's going to feel more like a slow increase in your overall energy and mood. However, so we're talking, I should say, so across maybe the next, 10 minutes to 20 minutes to hour to 3 to 4 hours. So this is think of it as a sustained release of energy. And the other thing that it does is every 24 hours, we have a release of a hormone called cortisol. A lot of people think cortisol is bad, but cortisol is important for your immune system, for energy, provided it's not too high or too frequent. This cortisol pulse is great, and it needs to arrive early in the day. And by looking at sunlight, you're going to get most of that cortisol occurring early in the day. You still have to mind your stress the rest of the day. But work from Stanford Med, from David Spiegel's laboratory and others, has shown that if you don't get that sunlight early in the day, what happens is that cortisol release starts shifting later and later and creates issues with insomnia and anxiety and even some low-level depression later in the day. Now, that does not mean that if you miss getting sunlight one day that you're going to get depressed. This is, again, a slow integrative mechanism. So the idea should be to get this bright light in your eyes every morning for about anywhere from 5 to 30 minutes, depending on how bright it is outside, and to do that consistently. You might miss a day here or there, get twice as much light the next day. Just stay out there twice as long the next day. You might say, well, this isn't practical. I've got kids, I've got family. I understand all that. I live in that landscape too. The key thing is to, take your phone outside if you have to use your phone, or take a walk in the morning, or bring the kids outside, or do breakfast outside in the morning. It can be indirect light. So it's a slow integrating mechanism over the course of hours that also lasts, believe it or not, for days. And know this because if you've ever traveled to a different time zone, your sleep cycle is really thrown off because it's still being regulated. Your sleep energy cycle and wakefulness cycle is still being regulated by the events that happened back home a few days before. So I don't want to tell people to not do it every day, because then they do it far too infrequently. Try to do it every day, but if you miss a day here or there, no big deal. And then the last thing is, because I always get this question, which is, if you wake up before the sun comes out, what do you do? Well, if you want to be awake, turn on as many bright lights as possible. And then once the sun is out, even if you're already at work, try and get outside for a few minutes. Don't try and do this through a window or a windshield. It just simply won't work. It takes far too long for reasons that we don't have to go into. So hopefully that covers all of the major details. I'm going to just tilt my screen here. Hopefully it'll stay on there, but and drop down here in my studio. But so hopefully that answers the question.
So you can look at, if it's dark and the sun's not out, you can stare into a lamp, and that'll feed your the sunlight factor for you, or does that work well?
Yeah. So if you're some people will buy sunlight lamps and these kinds of things. I think they're far too expensive for what they're really worth. If you are somebody who wakes up before the sun comes out, here's what I would do. I would get a ring light of the sort that people use for selfies.
I'm using one right now.
Okay, I'm not using one right now. It's funny, I'm looking at some of these questions. They just I'm not reading them, but they catch it. Someone asked, did you dye? I don't actually dye my hair. Actually, a lot grayer than this light makes me look. And believe me, I'm going gray at a rapid clip. No, don't dye my hair. I haven't dyed my hair since high school, I don't think. And I dyed it black when I was in high school. Why? I have no idea. Anyway, kids, don't dye your hair. The point is that, what you need early in the day is a lot of bright light. And now here's the kind of diabolical thing, which is that early in the day, you need a lot of bright light in order to kick these mechanisms in. And like right outside my window, if I were to turn my phone around, it's very hazy out, very overcast where I am right now. But if I were to measure the total number of photons, light energy, there's a ton of it. It's just scattered, so it looks really hazy. It's actually really bright out there, but I don't even know where the sun is, somewhere over to my left. The point is this: if you're indoors and you have a really bright light, it seems really bright, but it's not that bright. It's just very concentrated. Mm-hmm. Now, so early in the day, a ring light or something that gives you a lot of light everywhere is going to be great. Then come about 9 or 10 p.m., something switches in the system, in the eye and in the brain. And at that point, you need very little light in order to screw up this hormone melatonin and screw up your sleep cycle. So again, I don't want to make people neurotically attached to all these protocols thinking, oh, if you go to the restroom in the middle of the night and flip on the lights that you've destroyed your sleep for 3 days. It doesn't work that way. However, I strongly recommend people dim their screens way, way down at night, way, way down, dim lights, and even better, use dim lights that are set at table height or lower. The cells in the eye that set off all these mechanisms that I'm talking about, they basically look up in the visual field. So if you have a lot of fluorescent lights overhead, or you have a lot of ceiling lights, that's great during the day. And at night, you want to do the Scandinavian thing, which is to have, little lamp on the table in order to read. Or if you're going to read at night, really try and dim the light down as much as possible between about 10 p.m. and 4 a.m. And if you're a shift worker, and thank you, shift workers, we have an episode of the Huberman Lab podcast all about shift work. So you can go to hubermanlab.com and find that. It talks about using red light and different things you can do to offset some of the negative effects of shift work, because there are a lot of detrimental effects of shift work, unfortunately. But for most people who fall asleep somewhere between 10 p.m. and midnight, or 9 p.m. and midnight, and wake up somewhere between 5 a.m. and 8 a.m., that's about 80% of the world. For most of those people, what I just described will work really well. Get as much bright light as you can early in the day, ideally from sunlight. Then later in the day, like between 10 p.m. and 4 a.m., really try and limit that light exposure. And if you go to the restroom in the middle of the night, try and use a night light. The minimum amount of light to perform the necessary activities you need to do safely.
Right. I mean, I'm guilty as charged. I have my laptop in bed, and I'm learning from you to dim the light a little bit more, because I have it halfway, not full blast, but that will help. And I'm sure a lot of people out there have laptops when they're in bed or working on a late night project or something like that. It's hard to let that go, but knowing that you just gave that advice and about light and how it invigorates you and how you should have a nice sleep cycle, I think that'll help a lot. We've got a lot of other questions as well,
Sure.
Andrew. Aside from the light, I mean, let's sort of delve into sleep, because getting good night's sleep is very important for a lot of people. And we got a lot of questions about sleep cycles. Next month, we're going to go through that whole process of changing our clocks. So what kind of advice do you have, since we're going to fall back an hour, right? So we're losing an hour of sunlight, is that correct? But we get an hour more sleep. You think you are.
Right. Well, one more thing, because before we depart from light, because it relates to sleep. Mm-hmm. And if you are somebody who is going to be on your laptop or tablet or phone after 10 p.m., there's a wonderful practice that's zero cost that will help offset some of the negative effects of light late at night. And that is to see the sun or get some light in your eyes again a second time in the late afternoon. So when the sun is low in the sky, we call that low solar angle sunlight. It's just fancy nerd speak for sun low in the sky. And the qualities of light at that time are very different than when the light is overhead. You'll actually notice, snap a picture of a sunrise or near sunrise. Remember, you don't have to see the sun rise across the horizon. You need to see the sun rising, right? Think the verb, don't think the noun. Not sunrise, think sun rising. And then don't think that you have to see the sun set below the horizon, think sun setting, see the verb. Why? Low solar angle sunlight, viewed again later in the evening, triggers a different mechanism in the eye and brain that reduces the sensitivity of your visual system. It won't screw up your ability to see at all, but it makes it such that any light that you see late at night will have less of a negative impact on your melatonin production, and you'll sleep better. So what I'm basically saying here is try and get outside in the morning and see the sun rising, not sunrise, but sun rising, right? They're the same thing, but different. Because when people think sunrise, they think crossing the horizon. And then when people think sunset, they're more comfortable with the idea that it's setting, okay? But so it's an important distinction. And then at night, try and still avoid bright lights at night. Why? Well, here's the situation with respect to daylight savings and with sleep across the year. As the Earth rotates around the sun, it's tilted, right? So at different times of year, you get different amounts of light, the equinoxes and so forth, the solstices and equinoxes, as we know. And the total amount of light that you're getting from each day at certain times of year, right? You're getting less light, and then days get longer again. That amount of light is directly related to how much melatonin you make, because light inhibits melatonin. So this is getting a little tricky, but here's the point. If you look at the sun rising and the sun setting most days, your seasonal integrator, you literally have clocks in your brain that know are days getting longer or shorter. Those clocks will work better. And then when you undergo daylight savings, you'll find the shift much easier. Now, daylight savings is a human-made creation, right? This is not a naturally occurring phenomenon of the movement of the planets. This is a naturally occurring phenomenon of culture. And there's a lot of debate about it. But it exists, for at least for now, even though there's a lobby to remove it. So here's what you can do. We're heading into daylight savings. I highly recommend that when people wake up in the morning, they not only get outside, but they get some movement. Now, it doesn't have to be vigorous exercise. You could jog, you could do jumping jacks, you could do a few air squats, but you know what? You can even just walk. You could even just pace in your driveway a little bit. A little bit of movement at that time will compound with, it'll synergize with the effects of light and provide a second signal to your system that that is the appropriate time to be awake. Now, we're heading into daylight savings, so we're going to wake up and the sun's not going to be out. So most people are going to think, oh, well, then I wouldn't want to do that. No, because you don't have light, try and get a little bit of extra movement. So if you want to get up a little bit later, you would delay your light exposure and your movement a little bit, 30 minutes or so, heading into the weekend on Saturday or Sunday. And if you want to shift your clock the other way, you want to start getting up earlier, force yourself to get 10 minutes of pacing around outside, and you'll notice that your clock will shift much faster. There's one other way you can do it, but a lot of people don't like this one, is you can jump in a cold shower for 1 minute. That will wake you up. And it's no joke. The reason it wakes you up is cold water is a absolutely reliable source of adrenaline release in the body. And adrenaline kicks off the cortisol mechanism, which then says, wake up. Very simple. So cold water is usually cheaper than hot water. So I feel comfortable suggesting this. People say, how cold should it be? It should be cold enough that you really want to get out, but that you can stay safely in for 1 minute to 3 minutes. And then you can turn on the hot water if you're me. I'm kind of a wimp, and I then turn on the hot water. If you're tough, you can get out while it's still cold and dry off and head into your day.
So, you know, it brings new meaning to the phrase, take a cold shower. So that's great advice. You know, you talked about melatonin that is earlier, and we do have a question from one viewer. What are your thoughts on melatonin? To take melatonin pills, I mean, or to naturally have it in your body. What is your advice about taking melatonin pills? Does it really do much good?
So it's effective in that it can shift your circadian clock. I am a very strong believer, however, in avoiding taking exogenous melatonin. I really try to avoid supplementing with melatonin for a few reasons. First of all, it's now been well documented that many of the supplements that contain melatonin contain far too much. You know, you take 3 milligrams or 6 milligrams, that is a massive supraphysiological dose. You know, people hear about steroids in sports, and excessive levels of testosterone. This is literally, the equivalent of this like steroid effect of people taking huge amounts of anabolic hormones. Melatonin is not an anabolic hormone, but typically you make very, very little melatonin, but it's effective at putting you to sleep, not keeping you asleep. That's its role, to help you fall asleep. But when people take 3 to 6 milligrams of melatonin, that is a massive dose of melatonin. Now, that said, melatonin has other effects on other hormones. In fact, melatonin is one of the hormones that is chronically high in children and keeps them from going into puberty until it becomes cyclic, and then they enter puberty. There are other mechanisms for triggering puberty too, but melatonin in kids, I strongly discourage unless your pediatrician strongly encourages it, in which case always use the advice of your doctor to override anything that I say, because frankly, they're your doctor. And I always say I'm not a physician, so I don't prescribe anything. I'm a professor, so I just profess a lot of things, and it's up to you. I don't say that to protect me. I say that really to protect people, to protect you. Now, the other issue is that the supplement industry is complicated in that not all supplements contain what they say they contain, but this is especially true for melatonin. There's been an analysis of a lot of different supposedly reliable melatonin brands out there, and the dosages can be anywhere from 15 to 85% of what's listed on the bottle, or even 155%. So you don't actually know how much you're taking. There are healthier alternatives, but I want to really emphasize that, and I'll probably go into my grave saying this, behavioral tools first, right? Unless you have a clinical condition and you need a prescription drug, when many people do, use behavioral tools first. Morning sunlight, avoiding too much light late at night. Rely on those tools first. Then rely on quality nutrition, right? If you're too hungry or if you're eating too close to bedtime, both of those can inhibit sleep. Either one can inhibit sleep, right? If you're constantly thinking about food, that's going to be difficult to sleep. If you're overly full, you're going to wake up a few hours into sleep not feeling well. So the do's and don'ts of behavior and nutrition are going to be fundamental, right? Mm-hmm. Exercise, getting quality exercise, not drinking caffeine after 2 or 3 p.m. in the afternoon. Even if you can fall asleep, you're not getting the same architecture and quality of sleep. So before you start thinking about supplements for sleep or prescription drugs for sleep, it's really important to have all the other things right. And the nice thing about that is that all the other things are zero cost, right? There's nothing you have to purchase. So it's independent of budget. Now, that said, there are some supplements that have been shown to be very beneficial for sleep that have much greater safety margins than melatonin, and they fall into 4 categories. And here again, you have to talk to your doctor, but it's very clear that a variety of magnesiums can be effective in helping people fall and stay asleep. The most potent of those forms are magnesium threonate, spelled THREONATE, magnesium threonate, mm-hmm. as opposed to magnesium citrate, which has a kind of a major laxative effect, but to be quite direct, but magnesium threonate and bisglycinate are effective for setting a kind of a sedative motion and for enhancing the depth of sleep. And then something called apigenin, APIGENIN. Do you need to take it? Not necessarily. We have a newsletter at the hubermanlab.com, which is a toolkit for sleep that talks about these things. Apigenin is what's in chamomile tea. So you can also have a cup of chamomile tea, but guess what? Don't drink 4 cups of chamomile tea because you'll be waking up in the middle of the night to go to the restroom. Okay, so apigenin. So magnesium's threonate and bisglycinate, apigenin. And then there's a third one, which is actually used quite a lot for a variety of things, which is inositol. In particular, myo-inositol has been shown to help people fall back asleep if they wake up in the middle of the night. But these are all things that you would take 30 to 60 minutes before sleep. But, and I really want to underscore this, before you start thinking about supplements, get your behaviors right, get your nutrition right, exercise. That's going to serve so many other positive things: mood, focus, energy, everything. Essentially, they are the foundations of mental health, physical health, and performance. And a lot of people think, oh, what should I take for sleep? Well, you should take a walk in the morning and get some sunlight. You should take a walk in the afternoon for 5 minutes, even if you have to make a call, and get some sunlight. And then you should take your tablet or your phone or your computer and put it under the bed and read a book under dim light and go to sleep. So I'm sort of.
Have you been spying on me?
No, I'm only half. Listen, as I say all this, I'm far from perfect. I do my best, but last night I woke up, I went to bed very early, unusually early. I went to bed, for me, very early. It was like 9:30. I woke up at 3 in the morning feeling wide awake, but I didn't want to get up and out of bed. So I read under some dim light. I might have peeked at Instagram for a moment, and then I went back to sleep. But then when I woke up in the morning, I did make it a point to take a walk without sunglasses outside, even though it's a cloudy day, and et cetera, et cetera. So that's a long answer about melatonin, because the question to me about melatonin is really a question about supplements for sleep. There is one situation where melatonin can be very effective and largely safe if your doctor approves it, and that's for jet lag if you really are having trouble falling asleep in the new time zone, you can do it for a day or two to adjust, but you'll still want to do all the other behaviors that are going to allow your clock to shift. And the fastest way to shift your clock when you travel is to use exercise, a cold shower to wake up, no joke, and then to eat on the local meal schedule. Don't try and eat just when you're hungry, because what you have a clock in your gut, and that gut clock is the reason why when you travel, you get some stomach discomfort and you're not feeling quite right. Jump on the local meal schedule as well.
Okay, well, you're talking about food and nutrition, and I was looking at the questions coming in, and one viewer is asking about the carnivore diet. What do you recommend about that? Do you support that or not? Or, I mean, it's all about healthy living, right? You're talking about sun rising, sun setting. What about food?
Okay, here we go. All right, nutrition is one of the most barbed wire topics on the internet. So here's the deal. We have, and I'm just going to acknowledge that the variation. So you have some extremes. At one extreme, you have pure vegan, pure plant-based. Okay. In fact, there are people like Chris Gardner at Stanford. He's done a lot of work. Who's forgive me, Chris, if I'm getting this wrong, but I think he's a self-admitted vegan or vegetarian. I don't know about that. We had Dr. Justin Sonnenberg on the podcast talking about gut-brain health. He's my upstairs neighbor at Stanford in terms of laboratories expert in gut brain. And they've done some really important work showing that, for instance, getting 1 to 4 servings of low sugar fermented foods per day. So things like sauerkraut, kimchi, kefir, low sugar.
Vote for kimchi right here.
Yeah, love kimchi. My partner makes sauerkraut for us. So it's like, she's really great, makes a homemade sauerkraut, and it's actually the brine. So it has to be the stuff in the refrigerated section of your grocery store. So not pickles that sit in the non-refrigerated section, but the ones that sit in the refrigerated section contain ferment. Beer, yes, it's fermented, but I did an episode on alcohol. Listen, we can talk about alcohol, but I'm telling you, there's basically nothing good about alcohol in terms of your health. Hate to say it, folks, but no, I'll just say it now, and we can talk about this more later if you want. You would have to drink so much red wine to get the needed resveratrol to maybe have a positive health effect. No alcohol is better than alcohol, and the maximum amount of alcohol that anyone can drink, and of course with kids they should of course avoid it entirely, but and pregnant people of course can drink before negative health effects start to really show up, and these are increased cancer risk, disrupted gut microbiome, cognition issues, etc., is 2 drinks per week. Okay, now I'm not a drinker, so for me, that's no big deal. But for a lot of people, check out our episode on alcohol and your health. I have no bias one way or the other. I'm not going to tell people what to do, but just know what you're doing. Okay, that said, getting 1 to 4 servings of fermented food per day is enormously effective, regardless of what diet you cover or you choose. Now, so you've got your vegans, vegetarians, then you've got your omnivores, people like me. I do eat some meat and fish. I try and get it from organic, sustainable sources, humanely raised and farmed. That's for me important because I care about animals, and factory farming is not good. It also forces me to eat less of it. I eat vegetables and I eat starches like rice and oatmeal and pasta. I do like that kind of stuff, and fruit. So I'm an omnivore. And then you have carnivores. You asked about carnivore. Carnivore diet has undergone a different number of transformations. There's the so-called lion diet version of this, which is just meat. Then there's people will eat organ meat, so liver and pancreas, and really eating the so-called nose to tail, where they're eating all the heart and they're eating all the different organs, with this idea that organ meat is very beneficial. It does have certain nutrients. But then now carnivore diet has now been modified to exclude, of course it excludes grains and plants, but now they allow fruit in certain variations of the carnivore diet, and honey of all things, and certain non-pasteurized dairy. So when we say carnivore, we're talking about a lot of different things. And there are a couple of very colorful characters out there who are associated with this on social media. Here's the deal. I am an omnivore, and I'm an omnivore because when I look at my blood lipid profiles and I look at what's healthy for me in terms of my activity and lifestyle and need to think and stuff, I like eating some starches. But I think that for some people, it does appear that when they get on a ketogenic or a low carbohydrate diet, for whatever reason, they do seem to experience fewer of some of the symptoms that before plagued them, like fatigue after eating or some autoimmune issues or psoriasis. There does seem to be enough anecdata out there that some people feel far better. However, many people, other people I should say, feel far better on a pure vegan diet. So my stance is that independent of blood lipids and whether or not eating a lot of meat and organ meat is going to increase LDLs, which it probably will, and then people start debating how important is LDL, and I think most cardiologists would say very, very important, and then the people who are proponents of the carnivore diets would say, well, maybe not. So there's a lot of debate there that I don't want to get into. But I think that when you look across the whole, you have to ask yourself 4 things. What are my ethics, right? Do I want to eat animals or not? And do I want to eat animals that have been raised in one way or another, right? I've made choices about what, I won't eat any meat or any eggs or any cheese. It has to come from certain sources. That's me. 2, what are my needs? Like, am I burning a lot of glycogen? Am I doing a lot of high intensity exercise? And so on. 3, am I monitoring my blood work? I don't suggest switching to any extreme diet, what they call elimination diet. I don't recommend eliminating starches and vegetables a la carnivore, or eliminating, frankly, protein from meat and animal sources unless you have some baseline blood work with which to compare it to 8 months later. Check your LDL, check your hormone levels, right? Some people will stop menstruating. Some people's testosterone levels will drop. Some people's energy levels will go up. Some people, you need those data. And then the last thing is it really extends to what I believe is just personal choice. Ultimately, no one, unless you're being fed by your parents still, can force you to do something, and you should not be scared into following a particular nutrition plan, nor should you be duped by any ideas that one nutrition plan is suddenly going to transform you into a different human being. But with all that said, I know people that do exceedingly well on a vegan diet. I know people that do exceedingly well on the carnivore diet, but they are careful to monitor their blood work, especially LDLs. And I will say this, and I'm perfectly comfortable saying this, I think 90% of people out there can do really well on an omnivore diet, because if they are careful about one thing, which is really trying to get 80% or more of your foods from non-processed or minimally processed foods. Oatmeal is minimally processed. It's oats that are carved up, right? Ground to varying degrees. An apple is completely unprocessed, right? A bag of potato chips isn't going to kill you if you have it every once in a while, but it's highly processed. How do you know something's highly processed? It has a very long shelf life. If it's not processed, it has a very short shelf life. A banana, very short shelf life. And then minimally processed foods sort of fall in between. And so I think that's the ultimate foundation of good nutrition, is about 80% of foods minimally or non-processed. And then the other things that we discussed, I'd be happy to do a deep dive on those at some point later. Very little clinical trials, peer-reviewed data on carnivore, but frankly, very little about vegan diets either. And if you're an animal lover, or you think that vegan is better for the planet, or you're a sustainable ag person who thinks that meat is better for the planet, these people will argue forever and ever. Meanwhile, I'll be eating rice, oatmeal, pasta, meat, fish, eggs, cheese, minimally processed or non-processed as much as possible, and of course, remember, quantity of food matters too. It doesn't matter if you eat 2 ribeye steaks or a bucket of apples. If you fill your gut with too much food, most of the blood will be diverted there and you'll be tired. So if you eat too little, you'll be constantly thinking about food. And some people now do intermittent fasting, which some people like, because it's easier for them to not eat at all than to eat half the croissant. I'm one of those people. So, you really have to figure out what works for you. And this will change with pregnancy and kids, when you have an illness, et cetera. I realize that's a long-winded question, but it would be unfair for me. It would be unethical for me to just say, yeah, I think that diet's great for some people. I think there's a lot to consider when you're thinking about nutrition. And hopefully that was a thorough enough answer.
Following a certain diet, carnivore, being a vegan, can cause a lot of anxiety. And we got a lot of questions about anxiety. One person asked, how can I stop anxiety disorder?
Okay, so stress and anxiety are part of life, but that doesn't help. Just that I say that doesn't help. There are 2 things that I think are really important, and then a third that I'll start with. And that third thing is that when, the word disorder is something that we want to take seriously. There are people that either for physiological or psychological reasons, or a combination, right? And this could be rooted in childhood trauma, transgenerational trauma, or immediate circumstances, or just plain old physiology, your wiring where you don't know. It doesn't matter what the origins are. There are people where the anxiety is debilitating to the point where they really do need to talk to a board certified psychiatrist and or psychologist, right? Who can really do the assessment. And so I just want to say that first, because when I hear the word disorder, it's like, what's the difference between being obsessive and having obsessive compulsive disorder? Well, OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, means that the engagement in the compulsion actually increases the obsessions, right? And so that's a clinical syndrome that impairs life, right? So we talk about someone who's really neurotic and obsessive about eating versus someone with a true eating disorder. Like anorexia is the most deadly of all the psychiatric conditions, incredibly high death rate. So when I hear anorexia, that's a real thing, and someone needs to talk to an MD who can really help them parse that. So, and again, I don't say that to like protect myself or liability. This is really, when I hear the word disorder, that means something specific. And we are, of course, Stanford Med, and so we have excellent people here, and people have excellent, hopefully, medical resources near them to talk about disorders. Okay, now that said, everyone has anxiety at some point, and here's what's interesting. We don't have a lot of ways to know how anxious we should or shouldn't be. All we have is this tool, which we call language, to say, I'm anxious, I'm feeling low, I'm feeling stressed, I'm feeling, we know when we're comfortable, we know when we're uncomfortable. We all have varying levels of understanding about how comfortable or uncomfortable we are. Some people are just not aware that they're stressed. And some people, because of cultural, familial, or circumstantial reasons, just don't feel comfortable talking about their anxiety. Some people will text and call you all the time with their anxiety. So a lot of people are anxious who look calm, right? And that's important to remember. Okay, I do believe that there should be tools for this, and my lab and David Spiegel's laboratory have been working on tools for this. Dr. Aliyah Crum at Stanford, also at Stanford, so it has excellent work on this. I think that we need two kinds of tools: real-time tools to push back on anxiety and stress in real time, and then tools that raise our threshold so that we can tolerate more of life before we hit that stress threshold. And there are ways to do that. And we have a study that's in its very late stages now, but I'm happy to share with you some of the tools from that study. Again, this is a collaboration with our Associate Chair of Psychiatry, David Spiegel. There's a tool based on a natural pattern of breathing that we do in sleep that is very effective at reducing anxiety in real time. And it's called the physiological sigh. This was not discovered by me. This was discovered by physiologists in the 30s. And what it is that during sleep, every once in a while, a level of a gas in your bloodstream called carbon dioxide will get too high, and your levels of oxygen will get too low, and you're actually becoming asphyxiated. And you don't know it because you're asleep. And under those conditions, you will do a double inhale through your nose and then a long exhale through your mouth. So it looks like this. It's going to take me a second to do. I'm going to inhale really deeply through my nose. And then when I feel my lungs are full, I'm going to make every effort to sneak in a little bit more air. I'll tell you why in a moment. And then I'm going to release all my air. I'm going to empty all the air in my lungs, but through my mouth. So this is one physiological sigh I'm about to perform now.
Now, let me try that. Did I do that right?
Double inhale through the nose, long exhale. That's what it looked like to me. So inhale through the nose. Let's do it again. And then another inhale. And then long exhale through the mouth, all the way to lungs empty. Great. That
felt good.
Yeah, that pattern of breathing does something very special. And this is work that was also done by Mark Krasnow, a Howard Hughes investigator and another faculty at Stanford Med. The lungs are two big bags of air, but they have hundreds of millions of little sacs called the alveoli of the lungs that increase the surface area of your lungs. When you are stressed, you tend to underbreathe. You might think stress makes you breathe really hard. You're actually underbreathing or breathing in a way that carbon dioxide goes up in your bloodstream. These little sacs collapse like little balloons, and they're damp on the inside. And so like a balloon that's damp on the